Dan's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the dense forest. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Trees seemed to reach out with claw-like branches, tearing at his clothes as he ran. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum of impending doom. He had started his evening with a leisurely walk, hoping to clear his mind. But now the serene forest had transformed into a labyrinth of terror. The cool night air, once refreshing, now felt like icy fingers gripping his throat. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his legs burning with exertion. Behind him, the silence of the forest was punctuated only by his own frantic footsteps. Yet he knew he wasn't alone. Someone was following him. He could feel its presence, a cold, unrelenting force that made his skin crawl. Dan dared not look back, fearing what he might see. He pushed himself harder, every muscle in his body screaming for relief, but there was no time to stop, no time to rest. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees whispering secrets of old. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a hiding place, anything to put distance between him and his pursuer. The evening had begun peacefully enough. Dan had ventured into the forest to shake off the stress of the day. The moon was full, casting a gentle glow over the path. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the occasional rustle of leaves added to the tranquil ambience. He walked with a slow, steady pace, appreciating the solitude, but as dusk settled, an uneasy feeling crept over him. The forest grew darker, the path less defined. The sounds of nature seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Dan's steps grew quicker, his senses heightened. Then he saw it. A tall, shadowy figure at the edge of his vision. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But the figure moved, gliding silently between the trees. Dan's heart skipped a beat. Panic set in and he broke into a run, his mind screaming to get away. The figure followed, keeping pace effortlessly. Dan's fear escalated with every step. He zigzagged through the trees, hoping to lose his pursuer. The forest that once offered solace now felt like a prison, its dense undergrowth hindering his escape. The night had turned dark, and so had Dan's hope. Dan glanced over his shoulder, hoping against hope that he had lost the figure. What he saw instead chilled him to the bone. The shadowy figure was still there, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They pierced through the darkness, locking onto him with an unwavering gaze. There was something almost hypnotic about those eyes, something that pulled at his very soul. The figure moved with an eerie grace, its silent steps defying the natural order of the forest. It seemed to glide over the ground, leaves and twigs undisturbed by its passage. Dan's mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Was it a man, a ghost, some malevolent spirit haunting the woods? He forced himself to keep running, his body fueled by sheer terror. His breath came in short, painful bursts, and his vision blurred with tears of panic. The forest around him seemed to blur as well, the trees merging into a wall of darkness. Only those glowing eyes remained clear, a beacon of dread in the night. Dan's thoughts grew more frantic. He had to find a way out. He had to find safety. But where? The forest seemed endless, a maze with no exit. His only hope was to keep moving, to stay ahead of the figure. But with every step, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. The night was alive with terror, and Dan was its prey. Just when Dan thought he couldn't run any longer, he stumbled upon a clearing. There, in the middle of the forest, stood a dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging. But to Dan, it was a beacon of hope, a possible sanctuary from the terror that pursued him. He sprinted towards the cabin, his legs fueled by a last desperate burst of energy. The door creaked ominously as he pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a groan. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the floor was littered with debris. Dan slammed the door shut behind him, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the lock. The cabin offered little in the way of protection, but it was something. He looked around for anything to barricade the door, his eyes landing on an old, rickety chair. He wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would hold. He moved to the windows next, checking the boards for any weak spots. The faint light of the moon seeped through the cracks, casting long shadows across the floor. Dan's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but every time he thought he had a moment to breathe, the haunting memory of those glowing eyes would return, filling him with dread. Section 5. The Fragile Defense. Dan's breath came in shallow gasps as he assessed his fragile defenses. The cabin's door, barely held shut by the flimsy chair, was his first line of defense. He knew it wouldn't withstand much force. The windows, though boarded up, still allowed slivers of moonlight to creep in, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. He scoured the cabin for anything that could strengthen his barricade. An old bookshelf, dusty and weakened by time, caught his eye. With a grunt, he dragged it across the floor, positioning it against the door. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. His hands trembled as he worked, the fear gnawing at his resolve. Dan's mind flashed back to the figure with glowing eyes. Was it still out there, silently waiting for him to let his guard down? He strained his ears, listening for any sound that might betray its presence. The forest outside was deathly quiet, the only noise the pounding of his own heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The cabin, meant to be a refuge, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sent shivers down his spine. Dan tried to steady his breathing, to calm his racing thoughts, but the tension was unbearable, the silence almost deafening. Section 6. The Haunting Tap. Just as Dan began to think he might be safe, a sound shattered the silence. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, almost gentle, like the ticking of a clock, but it came from the boarded-up windows, a rhythmic tapping that sent chills down his spine. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. It was as if the figure was toying with him, reminding him that there was no escape. Dan's eyes darted to the windows, but he could see nothing through the narrow gaps between the boards. The light of the moon cast long, sinister shadows on the walls, adding to the eerie atmosphere. He wanted to scream, to shout at the figure to leave him alone. But fear had stolen his voice. The tapping was relentless, a maddening rhythm that echoed in his mind. Dan backed away from the windows, his heart pounding louder with each tap. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, the terror overwhelming him. Desperation clawed at him. He had to do something, anything to make it stop. But what? The figure outside seemed to have all the time in the world, its silent pursuit a cruel game. Dan's thoughts spiraled, the tapping a constant reminder of his impending doom. The cabin, once a hopeful refuge, now felt like a tomb. Section 7. The figure's entrance. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun, plunging the cabin into an oppressive silence. Dan's relief was short-lived. A loud crash shattered the stillness as the door burst open, the flimsy barricade giving way. Dan's heart leapt into his throat as the figure stepped inside, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its silent steps a stark contrast to the violence of its entrance. Dan backed away, his mind racing. He had nowhere to run, no way to fight. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and he felt a cold dread seep into his bones. It was as if those eyes could see into his very soul. Dan's mind screamed for him to do something, but his body was paralyzed with fear. The figure advanced slowly, its silence more terrifying than any scream. The air grew colder, and Dan's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He could hear his heart pounding, the sound deafening in the stillness of the cabin. He tried to find his voice, to shout, to plead, but no words came. The figure loomed over him, its presence an overwhelming force. Dan felt a crushing weight of dread, the sense that this was the end. The cabin, the forest, the night. All of it seemed to close in around him, trapping him in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Section 8. The silent standoff. Dan stood frozen, his eyes locked with those of the figure. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. The figure's eyes glowed with an intensity that made Dan's skin crawl. It was a stare that bore into him, stripping away his courage and leaving only raw, unfiltered fear. The silence was unbearable. Dan's mind raced, searching for any possible escape, but there was none. The figure blocked the only exit, its presence filling the small cabin. He could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seeped into his bones and made his teeth chatter. The figure's silence was a weapon more terrifying than any noise. Dan's thoughts spiraled into a chaotic mess of fear and desperation. He wanted to run, to fight, to do anything to break the standoff, but his body refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force. The figure's eyes never wavered, their glow a constant reminder of the terror that had driven him into the cabin. Finally, the figure moved, breaking the standoff. It took a step forward, and then another, closing the distance between them. Dan's breath caught in his throat, his heart thundering in his chest. He felt a wave of panic wash over him, his mind screaming for him to do something. But it was too late. The figure was upon him, its silence a shroud of doom. Section 9. The Vanishing Act. Just when Dan thought he couldn't bear the terror any longer, the figure stopped. It stood inches from him, its glowing eyes burning into his soul. Then, without warning, it began to fade. The edges of its form blurred, its glow dimming. Dan blinked, unable to believe what he was seeing. The figure grew more transparent, its outline dissolving into the shadows. Dan's breath came in ragged gasps as he watched, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible sight. Within moments the figure was gone, leaving only the lingering chill in the air. The cabin was silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Dan stumbled back, his legs weak with relief and confusion. He scanned the cabin, half expecting the figure to reappear at any moment, but there was nothing. The silence was complete, the cabin empty save for him. Dan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination, a product of his fear and exhaustion? He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching, waiting. The memory of its glowing eyes haunted him, a constant reminder of the night's terror. Dan knew he had to leave the cabin, to put as much distance between himself and the forest as possible. But the fear lingered, a shadow that refused to be banished. Section 10. The Lingering Fear. Dan stumbled out of the cabin, his legs barely supporting him. The moonlight cast long shadows on the forest floor, each one a potential hiding place for the figure. He moved cautiously, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs setting his nerves on edge. The night was still, but his heart pounded with the remnants of fear. Every step felt like a struggle, his body weighed down by exhaustion and dread. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him from the darkness. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt like a sinister maze, its paths leading only to more uncertainty and fear. Dan's mind replayed the events of the night, trying to piece together what had happened. The figure's silent pursuit, the haunting tap on the windows, its dramatic entrance into the cabin, and its mysterious disappearance. All of it seemed unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. But the fear was real, and it clung to him like a second skin. He knew he had to keep moving to find his way out of the forest, but the fear refused to leave him, a constant companion in the darkness. Every shadow, every whisper of the wind felt like a threat. Dan's breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling with the effort to keep going. The night seemed endless, the forest an eternal labyrinth of terror. Section 11. Conclusion. Shadows of the night. As dawn began to break, the first light of day pierced through the dense canopy, casting a faint glow on the forest floor. Dan felt a small measure of relief, but the fear still lingered. The events of the night had etched themselves into his mind, a nightmare that would haunt him for a long time to come. The forest, once a place of solace, had become a symbol of his deepest fears. He stumbled onto a familiar path, the way out of the forest. The sight of it brought a surge of hope, but also a reminder of the terror that had driven him to it. Dan quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the figure. The forest was silent, the night's terror retreating with the light of day. As he reached the edge of the forest, Dan paused and looked back. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows long in the morning light. The fear still gnawed at him, a reminder of the figure with glowing eyes. He knew he would never forget that night, the silent pursuit that had turned his world upside down. Dan stepped out of the forest, the weight of the night lifting slightly, but he knew the fear would follow him, a shadow that would never fully disappear. The forest, the cabin, the figure, they would always be a part of him, a reminder of the terror that waited in the shadows of the night.